Hey guys, I'm Mark. Welcome back to the shop. Today I'm going to show you how I took a gnarly chunk of cherry, filled it with resin, and turned it into this gorgeous French rolling pin. This entire project is an experiment. I had a hunch of what I expected the end result to be, but I had no idea if I could get it to that point or not. And going into it with that mindset allowed me to keep pushing the experiment a little further without necessarily caring whether it ended in success or failure. It was fun to keep trying new things just to see what would happen next. And this whole thing started because I had an off-cut scrap of wood that I refused to throw away just because it seemed like there had to be some use for it.
This is an off-cut from a huge cherry slab that I worked on last summer. When I cut this strip from the main slab, it separated right at the knot. I started to wonder if I could put it back together somehow, maybe with some resin to fill the gap. After a long time of thinking about it, I decided if I could get it to hold together, it might make an interesting French rolling pin. And that idea presented its own set of questions. A French-style rolling pin doesn't have an axle to roll around. It's just a cylinder with tapered ends for handles.
I'm going to use this football, which is just an exaggerated version of the same shape, to demonstrate my question. I figure if you're pushing down on those tapered ends, you're going to have some amount of force pushing back up in the middle, and I wasn't sure if the bond with the resin to the wood would be enough to withstand that force over the lifetime of the rolling pin.
This step may have been unnecessary, but since this is all an experiment, I decided to join the two pieces together before filling the void with resin in order to add a lot of strength. This is a lot like adding rebar in concrete. After using the joiner to get one perfect 90-degree corner on both pieces, I could use the radial arm saw to make sure the ends were square. Then, using my calipers and referencing off the flat faces, I marked where center would eventually be on the first piece. Because of the funny surface I'm trying to drill into, I used a chisel to flatten it out some so the drill bit wouldn't try to wander around. I used a clamp to help hold the board upright and perpendicular, then carefully drilled the hole at the drill press. To find center on the second piece, I put a drill bit into the hole of the first piece. Then, I used the fence of my radial arm saw to keep the 90-degree corners of each piece perfectly aligned while I tapped the point of the bit into the face of the second piece. Then, with that center marked, I could make another flat spot and drill out the hole. I cut a dowel to length and checked the fit. Everything lined up right, so I glued the dowel into one side, wiped away any squeeze out, and clamped it to the fence again. Then, I added glue to the second hole, slid that piece onto the dowel, and clamped it to the fence as well. My thinking was that this would hold those 90-degree corners in line.
So we let the glue dry overnight, and it worked out much better than I had actually thought it would. By clamping it to the fence of my radial arm saw, it really kept things right in parallel and square with each other. I'd actually left this oversized, too big to fit in my pressure tube, because I expected it to shift on me and I wanted to leave a lot of material there so that I could trim it down to size after that had happened. But this actually set up almost perfect. There's not much room. I could slide maybe a sheet of paper underneath there, but not much more than that. So that tells me I actually could have trimmed this off beforehand. But regardless of that, now we need to shave off the top enough and cut off one end just so that it fits inside our pressure tube.
I set the fence up on my bandsaw so that the board will be slightly taller than it is wide. This way I have a little overflow space when pouring the resin and can trim it square after the resin hardens. The type of resin I have on hand is Alumilite, and this stuff has such a short working time that it would start to set up before you could pull all the air bubbles out of it in a vacuum chamber. So instead you have to pressurize it, which compresses any existing air bubbles down so small that you can't see them. And this brings us to another experimental portion of this project. The major restriction when creating blanks with Alumilite is the size of the pressure chamber. The most widely used one I've seen is just a big metal pot with an airtight lid. Long before this project got underway, I started wondering what other sizes and shapes existed for pressure chambers in case I ever wanted to play with something of a different size. I didn't find anything I liked, so I built my own. 4-inch Schedule 4D PVC pipe is rated to a working pressure of 133 psi, and since it only takes 30 psi to crush the air bubbles in Alumilite, I figured this would be safe enough. If you want to see how I built my elongated pressure chamber, I will have a video coming out about it soon, so make sure you look for that. It was a simple project in itself, but I took lots of precautions to make sure it was safe. I let the blank sit until the next day, and I was like a kid on Christmas morning when I went to open up the chamber. Even though I wrapped it tightly and the resin cures quickly, I was still just a little nervous that the tape might have let go and I would find the whole thing permanently bonded to the inside of the pipe. Well, it turns out the tape held and the result was astounding. The blue and green colors I swirled together looked amazing, and the resin did a great job of filling up the space and bonding to the wood. I used the bandsaw to cut away the excess and give me a square turning blank. Then I marked center on each end so I could mount it on the lathe. But before doing that, I trimmed away the corners using the bandsaw to save myself a little time. The turning portion of this whole deal is probably the least interesting part. I just used a roughing gouge to bring the whole thing down to a long cylinder. I stopped frequently to check my progress, mostly because I was dying to see how that resin fill would look once it was round. Once I was really close to having an even surface across the whole blank, I used some sandpaper glued to a flat board to even out any remaining high spots. I measured and marked the location for the handles, then turned the waste away at the very ends to give me more room to work around the spur drive and tailstock. I trimmed the outside down to the desired diameter, then blended that point to the inner line in order to make the taper correct. There was a small crack in the blank due to another knot, so I mixed up some epoxy, then separately mixed in some blue and green coloring, then swirled them together to match the resin. This in itself was another experiment. I was nervous that I wouldn't be able to match the resin very well and it would look funny. My wife didn't tell me until afterward, but she thought it was going to be a bad idea and I should have just gone with clear epoxy. But now that it's finished, it's turned into one of her favorite little details about this piece. Once the epoxy had mostly set up, I pulled off the tape that I had used to keep it from running all the way around, then used a chisel to trim away the globs while it was still a little soft. I was afraid that if I tried to start turning again with these big wings sticking out, I might get a catch and rip a bunch of the epoxy back out. I turned the epoxy back down to mostly even with the wood, then used sandpaper to fine-tune it. At this point, the serious sanding began. If this was just wood, I would have sanded through 320 or maybe 400 grit. However, since I was going to have to polish the resin portion, I sanded the entire thing through 1500 grit paper before moving on to wet sanding. And the wet sanding was done using special polishing pads that start at 1500 grit and go to 20,000. I focused only on the resin portion, but there was no way to avoid getting the wood wet too. This left the resin glass smooth and gave a good indication of what the finished wood would look like.
So after I wet sanded this and essentially polished this resin fill, I let it sit for a couple of days to give the wood a chance to dry out. And now it's time for the next step in this series of experiments, and that is putting a finishing coat on top of this. Now the reason for it is this Alumilite resin isn't actually FDA approved, so you wouldn't want it coming in contact with your food. Now that's not to say that it's toxic. That's not true. I'm not really worried about it. It's just the FDA hasn't gotten a chance to say, go ahead and use it. So I've talked to some people over at Alumilite, and what they told me to try is their amazing clear cast resin, which is FDA approved. So what I'm going to do is coat the rolling pin in this amazing clear cast stuff and let it rotate at a very slow RPM, because this stuff sets up much slower than the Alumilite resin does. And so by letting it spin slowly, it's going to constantly be redistributing that liquid and letting it set up more evenly. That's my theory anyway. Like I said, it's another experiment, so let's try that out.
Unlike the Alumilite, which is measured 1-to-1 by weight, this clear cast is measured by volume. For the first round, I just wanted to put enough on to cover the whole thing with a skim coat so it could soak into the wood if it wanted to and let out any air bubbles that needed to escape. So I mixed a small batch together, then let it sit for a few minutes to let some air bubbles float to the surface and pop before brushing on that light layer. Once I got it applied to the entire surface, I slowly slid the brush all the way from one end to the other at a consistent rate to try to make the most even surface possible. Then I just let the lathe turn at about 60 RPMs for the next few hours while the resin set up. After about 8 hours, I applied the second coat. The process was exactly the same as the first, but I put the resin on a little thicker this time because I wasn't worried about air needing to escape from the wood anymore. At this point, it was starting to look pretty spectacular, but there were just a few fine cracks in the wood that were soaking up more resin than I expected, so after 8 more hours, I went for one more coat.
So now I've got 3 coats of finish on top of this thing. There was that one light skim coat, and then I put 2 thick coats on, and I've let it have a lot of time to dry. So now it's time to cut the 2 ends off of this thing that are holding it to the lathe.
I very carefully trimmed the ends down as far as I dared without the whole thing jumping off the lathe and self-destructing. Then I switched to a little handsaw to finish the job. My little helper was eager to give me a hand, so he helped out with the second side. Then he decided he wanted to address the camera for an update.
My dad cut the piece off of the rolling pin and it looks good now, and I think my mom will love it.
I think he's going to be pretty good at this stuff. The very last step was to gently clamp the rolling pin vertically in my bench vise and drop a little more resin on the end. I help spread it around a little bit, then let it level itself out and start to set up for a few hours before flipping it over and doing it to the other end. After 10 to 12 hours, this stuff seems like it's hard enough to touch and not mark it up, but it really takes a full 48 hours to completely cure. So with 3 coats and the 2 ends, it took almost a full week of finishing before we could do this.
I want to thank everybody for checking out this video. When people enjoy watching what I do, that makes the whole process even better. If you enjoyed this, hit that thumbs up button and leave me a nice comment, because the more interactions like that I get, the more people YouTube will show this video to. I've also got a long library of other videos, so make sure you check those out, and if you want to see what I come up with next, please consider subscribing. If you're already a subscriber, make sure you hit that bell icon so that you get notified every time I upload something new. Alright, one last thing before I sign off. I just set up a Patreon account. Now, if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a way for people to help support their favorite creators by setting up a monthly contribution that goes directly to them. There's also different rewards for different levels of contributions. So if you want to help me continue to make content like this, check out the link in the description and head on over to Patreon to see how you can get involved. Alright, I think that's it. Thanks guys, we'll see you next time.